In this video, we are going to be looking at parallel and perpendicular lines and their slopes. Parallel lines are lines that never intersect. You should already know that. That is a review. We have already been talking about parallel lines. A theorem with parallel lines is that if two lines are parallel, their slopes will be equal or the same. So if the slope of line A is 3 and the slope of line B is 3, are the lines parallel? Well, is 3 equal to 3? Yep. So the slopes are the same. So therefore, line A and line B would be parallel. If the slope of line A is 1/2 and the slope of line B is 2, are the lines parallel? Well, is 1/2 equal to 2? Nope, those are not the same numbers. So the slopes are not the same. So therefore, line A and line B would not be parallel in this case. Let's look at perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines are lines that intersect and create right angles. Right angles are 90-degree angles. So if two lines are perpendicular, their slopes are opposite or negative reciprocals. You can use opposite and negative interchangeably here. I'm going to really just focus on saying opposite, so I don't have to say opposite negative every time. It means the same thing. But what does opposite or negative mean? It means the slope will change signs. So if your slope is positive, the perpendicular slope will be negative. And if your slope is negative, your perpendicular slope will be positive. So it changes signs. So that's what opposite or negative means. Reciprocal might be a new term to you, but it also might be review. What does reciprocal mean? It means basically that the number is flipped over. So the slope is going to be flipped over. So let's do some examples and hopefully this will make more sense. So reviewing, if two lines are perpendicular, their slopes are going to be opposite reciprocals. So they have to satisfy both criteria. So let's look at an original slope of 3. Well, 3 is positive. So our perpendicular slope is going to have to be negative. And technically, 3 is actually 3 over 1. It's the same thing because when you divide by 1, it's equal to itself. And so flipping it over, doing the reciprocal, will be 1 over 3. So our perpendicular or opposite reciprocal slope will be negative 1/3. Next, let's look at 1/2. 1/2 is positive, so our perpendicular slope is going to be negative again. And to do the reciprocal, or you got to flip it the 1/2 over. Flipping 1/2 will give you the number 2. So your new perpendicular slope is going to be negative 2. Next, let's look at negative 4. Well, it's negative. And so our perpendicular slope is going to have to be positive. Because that's what would, the opposite part, that's what that means. Opposite negative, that's what that means. So our new number is going to be positive. Negative 4 is the same thing as negative 4 over 1, just like in the first example we did. So when you flip 4 over 1 over, when you flip it over, you get 1/4. So our new slope is going to be a positive 1/4. And then our last example is negative 1 over 5. It's negative, so our opposite reciprocal slope has to be positive. And then 1 over 5, when you flip that over, you get 5. So those are going to be our perpendicular slopes. So the original slope and then the new slope that I created, those slopes would be perpendicular, those lines would be perpendicular. And a hint, if you're kind of struggling with, if you want to go back and check your answer to make sure that you did the opposite reciprocals correctly, when you multiply the original slope and the opposite reciprocal slope, the product will always be negative 1 if the lines are perpendicular. So going back, multiplying 3 and negative 1/3, you would get negative 1. Multiplying 1/2 and negative 2, together, you would get -1. Multiply -4 and 1/4, you'll get -1. And same thing, -1/5 times 5, you'll get -1. So let's do some more examples. Based on their slopes, determine if the lines are parallel, perpendicular, or neither. So slope of line A is -6, slope of line B is also -6. So those slopes are equal, they're the same, so they are parallel. Next, slope of line A is 1/3, and slope of line B is -3. One's positive, one's negative. So they can't be parallel because those are not the same, they don't have the same sign and they're not the same number. And so to see if they're perpendicular, one's positive, one's negative, and that has to happen. But they also have to be reciprocals of each other. Well, when you flip 1/3 over, you're going to get 3. And so yes, these are going to be perpendicular. The next example, you have slope of line A to be 1/4 and slope of line B to be -1/4. Well, one's positive, one's negative, so they're not going to be equal to each other because they have different signs. However, 1/4 is equal to 1/4, so that means they're not reciprocals of each other. And so since they are not reciprocals of each other and they only change signs, they're going to not have any relationship with each other. They're not going to be parallel or perpendicular. Right? Next, let's look at -2/7 for slope of line A and -7/2 for slope of line B. Those are both negative numbers, so automatically those cannot be perpendicular because they're both negative. But they're not the same number. 2/7 is not the same as 7/2, and so those are going to also be neither. And notice in that example I just did, 2/7 is reciprocal of 7/2. But the reason why those two lines are not perpendicular are because both of them are negative, and one would have to be positive in order for them to be perpendicular. All right, our final example is slope of line A is 2 and slope of line B is -1/2. One's positive, one's negative, so they can't be parallel because they're not the same number, and they are also not that they don't have the same sign. One's positive, one's negative. To check to see if they're perpendicular now, we have to make sure that they change signs, which they do. One's positive, one's negative, and then that they are reciprocals of each other. Well, 2 is the same as 2/1. Well, when you flip 2/1 over, when you flip it over, you get 1/2. And so, yes, these are going to be perpendicular.